So, Jorge Masvidal has posted on X or posted an X on Twitter or tweeted on X or X'd on the platform formerly known as I don't care. I don't care what it's called. Masvidal has told the world that he's unretired, yeah? And that is what we're going to talk about in today's video. Right, there is no need to waste your time. Let's get right into it. I hate those videos where half of it is just rambling. You know who you are. So let's be on point with this. Masvidal has put up an X and instantly sent the MMA world into a frenzy. There's a lot of questions about this, like what are the implications for it leading into UFC 300? Is it related to Conor McGregor finally giving us a date for when he's back? And does it have anything to do with the timing of the UFC being in charge of its own testing and the fact that Masvidal became so low in testosterone in his last few MMA fights that they literally needed to Photoshop abs onto him into the promotional images? And then of course there is the dreaded MMA casual fan, but do any real MMA fans actually care that Masvidal wants to come back or is unretired? Right, like who really wants to see Masvidal come back and like any Masvidal interview where he just stares deadpan into a camera? Violence. Like, that's groundbreaking stuff, Masvidal. You're so entertaining. Please say violence again into the camera just one more time. And then, you know, like his last few MMA fights, they like Masvidal versus Burns, Masvidal versus Colby, they weren't that exciting, were they? Anyway, right, so Masvidal, he puts this tweet up and instantly my mind jumps to, I'm not surprised. Like I never really felt a retirement was more fake than Masvidal's retirement. There was like Conor's 100,000 retirements on Twitter every 2 weeks during 2020. And then there was like Henry Cejudo's retirement and we were all just like, really Henry, really, you're retiring? And then Masvidal is one of these retirements. Like, are you really, you're really retiring? But if you say you're back, you're back. And he's saying he's back at a very interesting time. Look, there are rumors flying around. There were rumors flying around of Conor versus Nate Diaz for UFC 300. Now, Conor has gotten drunk at dinner, which is fine. Like he can have drinks over dinner at New Year's, but he was drinking at dinner and finally announced that he'll be back for Michael Chandler at UFC International Fight Week, which leaves just Nate Diaz out there in the rumor mill. And I'm only bringing out the way that Conor announced it, the fact that he was drinking when he did it, to just say, just take that Conor announcement with just a pinch of salt. Yeah, like until the UFC announces it, like just consider that as much of a promise as a promise from any politician before an election week. Maybe Conor is just practicing to be the president of Ireland. But if the Conor news is true, at least the part that he will be fighting Michael Chandler, definitely, then we have Nate Diaz just out there in the ether somewhere. And why do I still think Nate Diaz is a name that we should be looking at? It's because Nate Diaz was offered just a ridiculous amount of money by the PFL, $15 million to fight Jake Paul in the PFL, in MMA. And I don't believe Nate turned down that much money for no reason. And also, look at UFC 300 just at the moment, yeah? Like, Sean O'Malley will not be on it. Volkanovski will not be on it. John Jones will not be on it. There's a good chance Sean Strickland or DDP will not be on it. Now Conor McGregor will not be on it. Leon Edwards will be on it, which means they need a bigger headliner. Well, they need a headliner for London. If Leon Edwards is going to be on UFC 300, who's going to headline London in the first quarter of next year? Which means Tom Aspinall will be at London. He won't be at UFC 300. So what names can be on UFC 300 now? UFC 300 is starting to look like a bit of a dud card. I mean, not dud, maybe dud's too harsh of a word. Like it's a totally fine pay-per-view, but Dana and the UFC and ESPN and anyone involved with selling UFC 300 made it sound like it was going to be the greatest thing to ever happen to MMA ever. Like you're just not going to believe how good UFC 300 is going to be. And at this point, with the names that they have already booked and the names that they have available, it's going to be a normal pay-per-view, man. It's going to be fine. Like, it's not going to be this rock your world pay-per-view. But Nate Diaz versus Jorge Masvidal 2, with how that fight finished last time, I mean, it was a wasted fight. That doctor's stoppage was a little too early for all of MMA to really enjoy that. And then there's always that excuse of Nate likes to get started in the later rounds. Like, that's one that you could easily slide onto UFC 300 and it's right there for the casuals to start making some noise. Like, so that one's there. I see some play for Masvidal on UFC 300 versus Nate Diaz. And then you've got the fact that Conor McGregor is going to come back, but he clearly wants to come back a little bit heavier. And Conor McGregor has a massive paycheck that the UFC needs to give him when he does come back. Conor McGregor also wants a tune-up fight, and Masvidal was not looking great in his last few fights. Masvidal is obviously heavier than McGregor. Masvidal also needs a big paycheck when he fights in the UFC. It's sort of a perfect, just tell Chandler to wait a bit, you know? Like, there is a nice way to line those two up that will sell a lot of pay-per-views if it indeed isn't Chandler when Conor comes back. Then there's the fact that the UFC has now got its own independent drug testing companies. I mean, it's the UFC who funded it and selected it and runs it, and it's the independent drug testing company that reports back to them to stay in business. But it's the best drug testing company you've ever heard of, mate. Just trust Dana White. Trust the UFC when they tell you it's 100% independent and it's the best drug testing company out there, mate. Believe me. Sure it is, Dana. It was no secret that Masvidal was on the decline, right? And that he signed a new 7-fight deal with the UFC. I think it was around the Colby fight, and it paid him a lot. They were investing in Masvidal to be a star. So this is one of those tests that we're now going to be getting where we know the UFC always want to see a return on investment, and maybe their independent drug testing company just lets Masvidal know when they're going to be testing him. Because remember, guys, the reason that we got rid of USADA was because we were all just so annoyed that they were waking up fighters at, say, 3 a.m. the night before a pay-per-view for random drug testing. We were all complaining about that. Well, guys, we got rid of USADA. We got in this new independent drug testing company, and we're going to be giving the UFC fighters that we want to succeed plenty of notice of when their test is going to be coming up. Just how you guys request it, just how we wanted to fix it. It's very convenient for the UFC, isn't it? And then the last thing to cover with Masvidal coming back, or maybe Masvidal saying that he's out of retirement, is truly, like, who cares? Who cares, bro? Like, who cares if Masvidal is back? Here we go. Like, prepare your hate comments now, but Masvidal in 2024 sucks as an MMA fighter. I'm sorry, but he was mediocre on his way out. He was mediocre in his historic rise up to 2019. Then he got that amazing knockout, rode that wave of, like, he had really good solid fights around 2019. But then he just went back to mediocre Masvidal, and his interviews were boring. Again, he's just staring at the camera saying, "Violence." I don't, and then he goes and stares at the camera and says, "Violence," and puts on these, like, lackluster, half-assed, kind of boring performances. It's just not that interesting to me to consider Masvidal really coming back. He's a filler athlete these days. I'm sorry, but he's just there to fill in fight cards. And Jorge Masvidal versus Nate Diaz 2 at UFC 300. That's a filler fight card, right? That's just a fill-in fight because we need something here on UFC 300. Look, that's just how I see it, and it's all caused because of Masvidal just releasing one single tweet. So I guess he is still pretty relevant. I mean, if you're going to sit down and chat about it for 8 minutes, he must have some sort of sway in the MMA world. That's just how I feel. Look, are you still a Masvidal fan? Are you excited to see Masvidal come back? Does that give you the fizz in any way? Let me know down there in the comments, just like End of Fate did. He says, if the UFC had a real competitor, then maybe, but you are way overestimating the PFL. Jake Paul ain't gonna bring MMA fans. He fought 2 weeks ago, and I missed it because I didn't even know. He needs a big name to get a big fight. And the biggest name that Bellator had was MVP, and guess what? He's with the UFC now. That is true. Francis, yeah, that's big, but it's one guy and it looks like he's going to go box. I will say this though, the UFC needs new stars very soon. All their big stars are on the way out, and O'Malley ain't that guy no matter how hard the MMA media is trying to tell us that he is. Yeah, end of fate. Look, that is true. They are pushing Sean O'Malley down our throats, but like I said in that whole, is Dana White's matchmaking going to ruin the PFL? The PFL are going to have way more media attention on them in 2024. And if they can really sell those storylines while that media attention is on them and they can build some internal PFL names while the UFC is selling us joke fights like Jones versus Stipe, it'll be interesting to see how the MMA community sort of reacts to that. All we need is a dud pay-per-view like Colby versus Edwards was against a really solid PFL card. And, you know, fans are fickle. Fans are fickle things. They can change their mind, but I guess time will tell. We are going to find out together. Thank you for leaving the comment. Let me know your thoughts on Masvidal and his return. Do you care? Put it down there in the comments section. If you're still watching this deep into this video, then maybe you've enjoyed it in some way. Before you go, if you could just go ahead and hit that subscribe button down there. It means so much to small channels like myself. Thank you for watching this one, and I will see you all in the next video.